Right after I joined the Air Corps, I had to take a test to see what I'd be good at. Pilot, navigator, bombardier, radar operator, whatever. This is in 1943 now, and I was a 21-year-old farm kid. When they called us together to announce the results, they said they had so many qualified people that it would be quite a while before anyone from our group could get into flight school. Well, this was pretty disappointing to a bunch of guys who were chomping at the bit to get into the war. But then another officer came in and asked if any of us had any engineering experience. I'd had 2 years of electrical engineering in college, so I put my hand up. He took us into another room and told us they were creating a brand new crew position for this big new super bomber that Boeing was building. The Air Corps wanted men with engineering experience to fill this position. Were we interested? Well, you bet. There were 11 guys on a B-29 crew, including the flight engineer, which on our crew was me. We were pretty excited the day we got our first look at the plane. A lot of people will tell you how impressed they were by the size of the B-29. The B-29 was big, all right, but as we walked out on the ramp, I remember being more impressed by the shape. It was just a big, long, smooth tube with wings. Compared to the B-17s and the B-26s we'd been training in, the B-29 looked, well, ungainly, kind of. I think a lot of that was the landing gear, though. The wheels have always looked too big to me. My position was back-to-back with the co-pilot. I remember sitting in front of my panel for the first time and thinking, there's no way I'm going to learn to work all this stuff. There were levers and dials and switches all over the place. But I just about memorized the manuals, and I started recognizing things pretty quick. There were the throttles, mixture controls, magneto switches, fuel transfer switches. There was a row of switches labeled cowl flaps. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but those doggone cowl flaps were going to give us more grief than the enemy, at least in the beginning. As I looked around the plane, I began to see the logic behind that long tube fuselage. The B-29 was designed to fly higher than any other bomber, up over 30,000 feet. Boeing knew we'd do a better job if we were comfortable, so they pressurized and heated the fore and aft crew compartments and the tail gunner's compartment. They didn't pressurize the bomb bays because of the doors. Cylinders and spheres are the best shapes to hold pressure, so that's why the B-29 looked the way it did. The fore and aft compartments were connected by a pressurized tunnel. We didn't care much for that tunnel, though. Crawling through it in flight was a pretty spooky deal. The B-29 was also designed to fly faster than any other bomber. It had what they called a high-speed, low-drag wing. The trick was to get this long, narrow wing to fly slow enough to land. A Boeing engineer named George Shirer figured out that by adding what they called Fowler flaps to this high-speed wing, we could have a top speed of almost 400 miles an hour and a touchdown speed of less than 100. Our aircraft commander, that's what they call the pilot on a B-29, when he first sat down in his seat, he expressed a real concern about making takeoffs and landings, and I could see why. He sat way up there off the ground, way off to the side of the center line, and way back from that curved windshield. It wasn't long, though, before both our pilot and our co-pilot were bragging about how the B-29 handled better than anything in the sky. Better than any other bomber, maybe. But I think they were stretching it a bit when they said anything. Of course, the thing I was most interested in was the engines. The B-29 had a new type engine, a Wright R3350. Each one developed 2,200 horsepower. But it didn't get that power from size. It got it by having 2 rows of cylinders, a high compression ratio, and twin turbo superchargers. Then they put a real tight cowl around it to keep the drag down. This is where we had the problems. You take off on a hot day and the cylinder head temperatures would go right off the dial. Then the lube oil would boil away from the valve stems and maybe a valve would stick and break. The piston would punch this busted valve out the side of the cylinder, the fuel mixture would spray out the hole, and you'd have a fire. We lost a lot of airplanes that way. Eventually, they improved the cooling and got more oil to the valve stems, but ask anyone who flew the first ones in India and China, and I bet they still don't trust those engines. It's important that people understand what a terrific achievement the B-29 represented, but I think it's just as important that they understand who it was that was flying them. We weren't a bunch of sophisticated, mature guys like you see in the movies. Our bombardier was 22. Our co-pilot was 21. Now, the B-29 had what they called central fire control. The gun turrets were remote controlled. Our CFC gunner, the guy who watched the fighters and decided which turrets to connect to which gun sites, the guy making these life or death decisions, was a 19-year-old pinball wizard from St. Louis. Our pilot now, he was old. He was 23. The B-29 was the 747 of its day. It was that advanced. Think about that for a moment. A 747 flown by a bunch of 20-year-olds. You wouldn't even get on a plane today with a crew like that. Yet we flew that thing on 16-hour missions with engines out, on fire, shot full of holes, in terrible weather. We may have looked like a bunch of kids, and we sure acted like a bunch of kids sometimes, but we made that airplane work. I had a chance to talk to some Boeing people when we were training in Kansas. It seems that some of the fellows in charge of designing the B-29 weren't a whole lot older than we were. Ed Wells had been the project engineer on the B-17. George Shira knew more about wings and wind tunnels than almost anybody. And George Martin was a whiz at figuring out how to make things stronger while making them lighter. Then there was Wellwood Beale, who had designed the Boeing Clipper, and Eddie Allen, probably the best test pilot ever. Considering what was demanded of them, they really pulled off a miracle with the B-29. Before the war, Boeing had come up with a long-range bomber design called the 341. The Air Corps liked it, but when the war broke out in Europe, they realized they'd need a plane with an even bigger payload and range. Boeing expanded their 341 design, lengthened the wings, went to more powerful engines, and called it the Model 345. The 345 was the B-29. I'm not sure who had it harder, the guys fighting the war or the people who had to get the B-29 into production. The Air Corps wanted the plane so bad that a month after the basic design had been submitted, the government approved money to buy 990 of them. Boeing hadn't even finalized the design yet. By the time XB-29 number 1 was ready to fly, the Air Corps had already ordered 1,600 airplanes. You can imagine what a nightmare this caused. We were in the war ourselves now, and Boeing was cranking out B-17s as fast as it could. They didn't have any factory space left to build anything else. Out in Wichita, Boeing had been making Stearmans, little biplane trainers. They'd never even seen anything like a B-29 before. And all of a sudden, this order comes down to build a new factory, set up an assembly line, hire a ton of people, and start building this monster airplane that hadn't even been tested yet. The same order went to Bell Aircraft in Georgia and Martin in Nebraska. The fourth B-29 plant was in Renton, Washington, but at least they didn't have to put up the building. They used one the Navy had built for a flying boat program. I had to pick up some parts at the Wichita factory once. It was incredible. The fuselages and wings went on for acres, it seemed. But even more incredible were the people. This wasn't a factory full of professional mechanics like you see at Boeing today. The B-29 was built by housewives and secretaries and oil rig workers and store clerks and farm hands, all of them working their hearts out to help win the war. When we started flying combat missions from India and China, we were still working the bugs out of the airplane. But what we had to deal with was nothing compared to the problems they'd had to solve with the first ones. Aerodynamically, the B-29 was an outstanding design right from the beginning. The fact they never changed the shape proves that. But the more complicated an airplane is, the more problems it's going to have in the beginning. And the B-29 was the most complicated airplane in the world. Add the pressure everyone was working under, and you've got the perfect setup for mistakes. They almost lost XB-29 number 3 because someone got the aileron cables backwards. But the worst problems were engine fires. Eddie Allen was a legend as a pilot, but even he couldn't save XB-29 number 2 when fire spread through the wing and into the cockpit. Eddie's death was a terrible loss, not just to Boeing and the B-29 program, but to all of aviation. But the testing had to go on. The factories were already building the planes. General Hap Arnold had created the 20th Air Force specifically for the B-29. His goal was to get 175 planes into combat by March 1944. We kept waiting for orders to go pick up our airplanes, but nothing happened. Then I got orders to report to an airfield in Kansas, Pratt, Kansas. When I got there, I found out why we didn't have our B-29s yet. The planes were a mess. The fixes to the problems that were showing up in flight test had to be put into the planes on the assembly line and the ones that were already finished out on the ramp. The original glass panels in the nose distorted the pilot's view, so they all had to be replaced. Then they had to open up the wings of the completed planes to beef up the wing structure. Tearing apart a finished airplane isn't something you want to do anyway, but doing it outside in one of the coldest winters on record makes it even worse. The fact that all the changes were made without slowing production tells you something about the kind of people who were building the plane. The real hang-up occurred after the planes were delivered. The Air Corps had their own set of changes. They wanted to modify the gun system, put fuel tanks in the bomb bays, change the radio gear, all kinds of things. The Air Corps mechanics doing the work tried their best, but they'd never worked on anything like the B-29 before. When I got to Pratt, the wiring in the planes was so screwed up that flipping on the panel lights would sometimes open the bomb bay doors. By the beginning of March, not a single one of General Arnold's first 175 planes was ready. The Air Corps was desperate. Boeing and Wright and subcontractors like General Electric pulled their top people off the assembly lines and sent them to the modification centers. Even crew chiefs and flight engineers like me were sent up there to help get the planes ready. It was so cold, we could only work 20 minutes at a time. The planes were all opened up, so there was no way to heat them. We had stoves set up just to keep our tools warm. But in 6 weeks, we had the planes ready to go. The B-29 had won its first battle, the Battle of Kansas. The plan, which of course we didn't know anything about, was to base the B-29s in India with advanced bases across the Himalayas in China. This would put us within striking distance of enemy strong points in occupied China and clear down the coast to Singapore. Even more important, by filling the forward bomb bay with fuel tanks, we would be able to reach the southern end of Japan itself. While Boeing was building our airplanes, the Chinese were building our runways. This was no dump truck bulldozer operation. They built the runways by hand. When they needed gravel, they made gravel. When they needed mud to glue the gravel together, they made mud. The term horsepower didn't apply here. A few weeks after I was sent to Pratt, the rest of my crew showed up, and we were finally assigned our very own B-29. I remember we had some heated discussions over what to name it, but we still hadn't settled on anything when we took off for India in April. Our bases in India were pretty grim. The water was bad, there wasn't any ice, and there wasn't any beer. The heat and humidity were exhausting. The simplest task wiped you out. By mid-morning, the aluminum would be so hot you couldn't touch it without getting burned. We had to rely a lot on Yankee ingenuity. We changed flat tires by pulling the planes up a homemade ramp with a tractor. We changed engines, and we changed them a lot, with homemade A-frames and chain hoists. Then at night you'd lie in your bunk and hope the scratching noise on the floor wasn't a cobra. We flew the longest missions of anyone in the war. 16 or 17 hours from India to Singapore and back was not unusual. The missions we flew from China were shorter, but they involved a lot more work. Everything we needed, bombs, gas, ammo, you name it, had to be flown over the mountains to our airstrips in China. We'd have to fly 7 missions over the hump to stockpile enough stuff for one bombing mission. People ask me what was the most dangerous thing about flying in the war. That's easy, the takeoffs. The B-29 was designed for a gross weight of about 120,000 pounds. We loaded them to 140,000 pounds. It took all the power we had just to get off the ground. The only way I could keep the engines from burning up was to open the cowl flaps. But the flaps added drag. So now we were in danger of running out of runway before we reached flying speed. We were stuck. The pilot wanted acceleration and I wanted cooling. And if either one of us got what we wanted, there was a good chance we'd all end up dead. That's where those cowl flap switches came in. As we'd accelerate down the runway, I'd ease the cowl flaps closed as much as I thought I could get away with. The engines would still overheat, but we didn't have any choice. Every takeoff was a gamble. Will we get in the air, run off the runway, or blow up the engines? We'd find grass and bushes in the landing gear sometimes. It was that close. Fighters, flak, weather, they were nothing compared to the takeoffs. We had another takeoff problem in China. The Chinese believed you could cure bad luck by killing the evil spirit that was following you. Apparently, they figured the best way to kill an evil spirit was to run over it with a B-29 because they kept dashing across the runways in front of our airplanes. Here's some of them doing it here. The evil spirits weren't the only losers, though, because occasionally these fellas ended up in the props. It was a bad deal, but we couldn't get them to stop doing it. You had a lot of time to think on a 16-hour mission. Mostly we thought about home and girls and whether we'd have enough gas to get back to base. If we lost an engine, we wouldn't burn as much fuel, but we wouldn't go as fast either. No matter how bored people said they were, you always worried about having enough fuel to get back. I lost a lot of friends to empty fuel tanks. When we got back, we'd start the cycle all over again. Fix the planes, fly the hump, fly a mission. Fix the planes, fly the hump, fly a mission. The same day we flew our first mission from China, the Marines landed on Saipan in the Marianas Islands. By late 1944, airstrips had been built on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and B-29 operations were shifting from India and China to the Pacific. Most of our original crew had gone home. Our co-pilot had become an excellent aircraft commander in his own right, and he and I went to the Marianas with a new crew and a brand new plane. Our old one ended up in a ditch. It hadn't been without its problems, but it had hung in there for us over the hump and on those long slogs home from the target. The replacement crew lost it on their first takeoff. I'm glad I wasn't there to see it. Life on the island was a whole different deal. The weather wasn't as bad as India, but there was even less in the way of entertainment. Between missions, you worked on the airplanes, went swimming, worked on the airplanes, played football, worked on the airplanes, stole ice cream from the Navy, and worked on the airplanes. That was it. Life off the island was a different deal, too. The fighter opposition was fierce, and the targets were defended by radar-directed guns that were accurate. Our B-29s began taking hits. People might argue this point, but I think the B-29 stood up under punishment as well as the B-17. Our gunnery system was effective against fighters, but not against flak. We had engines knocked out, chunks of wing torn off, holes punched in the sides, but the B-29s kept flying. We also discovered we could get 5 or 10 miles an hour more speed if we washed the plane down with gasoline before a mission. We figured anything that made us harder to hit was worth the effort. Takeoffs were still a problem, though. We needed more power, but there wasn't any more to be had. Then Ed Wells and some other Boeing engineers came out to the Marianas in a specially instrumented B-29. They discovered that our engines weren't getting enough air because of the high humidity. There was almost as much water in the air as air. The only way to get the proper amount of air into the cylinders was to deliberately overboost the throttles, which of course we'd been taught never to do. When we started using Boeing's new throttle settings, our takeoff performance improved a lot. We'd fly low to save gas on the way to the target, but then we'd climb to 30,000 feet or so for the actual bomb run. This made it harder for the fighters to get at us, but our bombing accuracy from that altitude was lousy, especially if we had to bomb using only the radar. Sometimes we'd get over the target and our ground speed would be 500 or 600 miles an hour. We'd be going so fast the bomb sight couldn't compensate for it. What we'd discovered was the jet stream. No one had even known it had existed until we started experiencing those tremendous ground speeds in our B-29s. When we switched to low-level bombing in March 1945, our accuracy improved, but the planes started getting beat up a lot more. Sometimes a shot-up B-29 would barely make it back to base. Others would fly back without a scratch, and then the crew would find out about the hole in the brake line. I'm glad I stayed with the B-29 because I got to watch it change. In the beginning, it tended to be a big 4-engined headache, but one by one, The problems were solved, and by early '45, it had become just a terrific airplane. I lost track of how many times our airplanes saved our lives. Sometimes it was a piece of armor plate that stopped a cannon shell. Sometimes it was a fire bottle that snuffed out an engine fire. In combat, you took all these things for granted. But back on the ground, you began to realize the only reason you were still alive was because of this thing the Air Corps called a B-29. But they weren't B-29s to us. To us, our airplanes were Southern Belle and Misbehavin' and Dynamite. You don't give something that's a part of you a number. You give it a name. Things got a lot better when the Marines took Iwo Jima. Now we had a place to land if we were running low on fuel or were too shot up to make it home. And for the first time, we had fighter protection over the target. I felt bad for the fighter pilots, though. Sit in a hard, uncomfortable chair for 7 hours without moving, and you'll see why. Their crew chiefs often had to lift them out of their cockpits at the end of a mission. I was rotated home 2 days after the war ended. But the B-29s kept flying, dropping supplies to POW camps and carrying relief food to Okinawa and Japan. Then the B-29s flew home too. The wrecks were hauled away and the Quonset huts were torn down. Pretty soon, the only proof we'd been there at all were the runways the Seabees had carved into the coral. They'll probably be there forever. 5 years later, the Chinese communists poured across the border into South Korea, and we had to do it all over again. At least we didn't have to build the B-29s this time. All we had to do was cut them out of their mothball cocoons. When I heard they needed experienced flight engineers to help train the new crews, I raised my hand and said, "I'm your man." The B-29s were operating from Okinawa and Japan. In a way, it was kind of sad. 5 years earlier, the B-29 had been the best bomber in the world. Now it was a sitting duck. Technology had passed it by, and the MiGs flew circles around it. I worked with some of the reconnaissance crews, the guys who flew B-29s over enemy territory to take pictures. We didn't have spy satellites back then. They went in solo, no escort, without a gun on the plane, just cameras. They dodged MiGs and flak and anything else the enemy could think of to bring back the pictures. The recon crews took a terrible pounding, but they stuck with it. Without them, the guys on the ground wouldn't have had a chance. I flew on a couple of bombing missions as an observer. The only opposition we had over the target was flak, but I remember being totally stunned by the speed of the jets that went with us. It was a different war, but some things never change. The weather is always crummy, and the crews are always kids. The last time I saw a B-29 in government service was at Muroc, Edwards Air Force Base to you younger folks. The old Superfortress made a good, stable launch platform for the experimental rocket planes they were flying out there. When I'd seen the newsreel footage of Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, I remember wondering how the heck they'd managed to fit the X-1 under the B-29 to load it. I'd whacked my head on the bottom of a B-29 enough times to know there wasn't that much clearance under the plane. They were still flying the Bell X planes when I visited Muroc in the mid-50s, and I found out firsthand how they did it. Darned if they weren't using the same thing we'd used in India. Good old Yankee ingenuity. First flight of the B-29 was in 1942. 5 years later, Ed Wells, George Schira, George Martin, and all the other folks who'd created the B-29 rolled out the B-47, and that was it for the piston engine bomber. The salvage company set up furnaces right on the fields where our B-29s were stored and melted them down on the spot. I'm retired now. I went on to other things after the Korean War, and my experiences with the B-29 kind of faded into the background. Then on a rainy day in February '91, the last B-29 came back to Boeing. FIFI had been parked in the desert as a gunnery target, then forgotten. Years later, she was pulled out of the sand and restored to flying condition by the Confederate Air Force. The air show circuit took its toll, though, and FIFI needed the kind of care only the people who had built her could give. The Restoration Committee put out a call for volunteers, and the response was overwhelming. People who hadn't seen a B-29 in over 40 years began working on parts they thought they'd never touch again. When they were done, Boeing slipped FIFI into their production schedule, and she was repainted in one of the Everett paint hangars. I'd love to have a copy of that month's painting lineup. 747, 767, B-29, 747. FIFI flew over my house when she left Seattle. The sound of those engines pulled me outside, and as I watched those long, slim wings move across the clouds, I was back there again. The sizzling heat in India, the towering thunderheads over the hump, the dusty runways in China, the brilliant white coral of the Marianas. Looking at these films now, it's hard to believe that was us. But then it starts coming back. The smell of oil and hot metal as we worked on the engines. The cheers of the guys playing football on the next hard stand. The endless hours of staring down at the ocean. But mostly, I remember things about people. Our co-pilot's lousy jokes, our tail gunner's addiction to comic books, our ability to break just about anything, and our crew chief's ability to fix it. The people. That's what made the 50th anniversary celebration so important. Seeing the airplane again, that's exciting, no question. But seeing guys you flew with, or meeting someone who built your plane, that was special.
We recognized each other instantly. Instantly. And that's not.
I was 19. I gained a lot of maturity in a hurry. And responsibility, you know. Suddenly the rest of the crew and everybody was responsible for each other, not only on the flight, but when you would go on leave and everything else. You became sort of a family rather rapidly.
We were as vulnerable as anybody else. We were just miracles the way we got back.
We had all of our stuff already designated who got what. I know that McClellan's supposed to get my trumpet.
As far as what the B-29 meant, it just, first of all, it cemented relationships with our crew. To me, that was the most important thing. I met some wonderful people, both in my crew and other crews and ground people. It was just I wouldn't say a wonderful experience. It's war. People are getting killed. But it was an experience of a lifetime.
50 years ago, I'd just turned 20, and Eddie Allen took the XB-29 up for the first time. I probably owe more to that flight than I'll ever know. You grow up fast during a war. The B-29 taught us about teamwork, about taking the responsibility to see a job through. Boeing and the Museum of Flight gave us a chance to say thanks. Thanks to the airplane, and thanks to the people who worked their tails off to make sure we got home safely. So, what had we accomplished? Ed Wells, Eddie Allen, and the men and women on the assembly lines and the kids in the cockpits. Can you justify taking a single life because doing so will save hundreds of lives? Our value system at the time said yes. Maybe it still does. The planners assumed that an invasion of Japan would cost 1 million American lives and probably even more Japanese. But starting with those first tentative flights from India and China, we gradually reduced the terrible specter of an invasion to nothing. It was the one evil spirit the B-29 killed, for sure.